In a quiet town, where everyone knew each other's name and secrets, a young boy named Theo found something he wasn't expecting. It wasn't just any ordinary object, it was a wallet, old and weathered, sitting in the middle of the sidewalk. Theo glanced around, his heart racing. The streets were empty, but the wallet's presence felt like an invitation. Without a second thought, he picked it up, feeling its weight in his hands. He opened it, hoping to find an ID or something that could help him return it to its rightful owner. Inside was a few bills, some change, and an ID card that read, Franklin Miller. The picture on the card showed a frail elderly man, his eyes soft and kind, but there was something about the name that gave Theo pause. He had heard of Franklin Miller, he was a regular at the small diner on the corner. But why was his wallet just lying there? Theo wasn't one to question fate. He had always been taught that good deeds were their own reward. As he turned to walk to the diner, his thoughts filled with the kindness of returning something lost, he felt proud. This was the right thing to do. The warm feeling of doing something good washed over him as he approached the diner's door. But what happened next would leave Theo questioning everything he thought he knew about good deeds. Just as Theo was about to step inside, the door swung open and an officer from the local police department stepped out. He looked at Theo for a moment, eyes scanning the wallet in his hands, and then glanced back into the diner. Within seconds, another officer emerged from inside, and the air suddenly grew thick with tension. Theo's heart dropped. The officer's eyes were fixed on him now. A chill ran down his spine as they approached. "What do you have there?" one of them asked, his voice sharp. Theo's mouth went dry. It's a wallet I found. I'm just returning it to the man inside." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exchanged a look with the other. It was brief, but Theo noticed the subtle shift in their posture, like they were unsure of something. Before he could say another word, the first officer took a step closer. "You're sure that's all, boy?" he asked, his voice now cold. Theo nodded, though uncertainty crept in. The feeling that this was not just a simple return of a lost item gnawed at him. What was going on? Why had the police just shown up out of nowhere? The wallet in his hands no longer felt like a simple object, but a symbol of something far more complicated, a moment that would change everything. But in that moment, Theo couldn't know just how much it would. The town of Brookhaven was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, most of them unchanged for decades. The locals would tell you that the town was the epitome of peace and tranquility, but Theo had always known there were secrets hidden just beneath the surface. It was easy to believe that life was simple in a place like this, until something disturbed the calm. Theo, a 16-year-old boy with big dreams but little direction, was one of the many who felt like they didn't quite belong. His family had been in town for generations, but that didn't make them immune to the whispers behind closed doors. People knew him, but they didn't really know him. Theo had learned early on that when your last name didn't come from wealth or prestige, you had to work a little harder to prove you were worthy of respect. He didn't mind. His heart was full of good intentions, even if the town wasn't always ready to accept him for who he was. The wallet, though, was different. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference. After all, how many kids his age would stop to return something they'd found on the street? But the moment the officers arrived, that sense of pride quickly began to waver. Inside the diner, a familiar buzz filled the air as people sipped coffee and shared stories. The elderly man, Franklin Miller, sat alone in the corner, his eyes on the window as if lost in thought. Theo had passed him countless times but never really noticed him much. Franklin was a quiet man, one who kept to himself but always greeted people with a warm smile when they passed by. He had a reputation in the town for being kind, though no one really knew much about his past. Theo stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Franklin. He felt the officers behind him, their presence so close he could hear the soft rustle of their uniforms. The air in the diner was thick with tension, and Theo wasn't sure what to do. Should he just hand over the wallet? Or was there something more at play here? The questions swirled in his mind, but before he could make a move, the officers took charge. "Mr. Miller," one of the officers said, his voice crisp. "We need to speak with you." Franklin looked up, his face pale, his once warm eyes now filled with something else, fear, perhaps. He slowly stood up, looking at Theo with an expression that made the boy uneasy. It wasn't the gratitude he expected. Instead, there was an almost sorrowful look in his eyes, like Theo had just done something that couldn't be undone. As Franklin approached the officers, the second officer turned to Theo. "Stay right there, son," he instructed. His voice was sharp, like he wasn't asking, but telling. Theo didn't move, his mind racing. Was Franklin in trouble? And if so, what had that to do with him? The situation was spiraling out of control. And Theo felt like he was caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. Minutes passed before Franklin was escorted out of the diner by the officers. They didn't explain why, only that he was needed at the station for further questioning. Theo's heart sank. It didn't make sense. He had done nothing wrong, he had simply returned a lost wallet. Yet now he found himself tangled in a web of confusion and suspicion. The officers finally turned to him. "You," the first officer said, motioning for Theo to come forward. "What's your name?" "Theo." "Theo Green," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "And you found this wallet, you say?" the second officer asked, his eyes narrowing. "Yes. I was just returning it to Mr. Miller." The officer studied him for a moment. Theo could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The officer's gaze flickered briefly toward the door where Franklin had just been taken, and then back at Theo. "This town has a way of hiding things," the officer said quietly, almost to himself. "You should be careful, Theo. Not everything is as it seems." With that cryptic remark, the officers left, leaving Theo standing in the doorway. The warm buzz of the diner was gone. The light seemed dimmer, and the familiar faces of the regulars now felt distant and unfamiliar. Theo had the sudden feeling that he wasn't just a boy who had found a wallet. No, in this small town, he might have stumbled onto something much bigger than himself. What was Franklin hiding? Why had the officers treated him as if he were guilty of something? And more importantly, why did it feel like Theo had unknowingly walked into a trap? Theo left the diner, his head spinning with questions. The wallet, once a simple symbol of a good deed, now felt like a piece of evidence in a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. But as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he realized one thing: he couldn't turn back. Whatever was happening, it was too late now. He was in this story, whether he liked it or not. The chill of uncertainty hung heavily over Theo as he walked down the empty street. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. His mind raced with thoughts of the elderly man, Franklin Miller. What had he been hiding? And why had the police come so suddenly, like something had triggered them the moment he returned the wallet? Theo couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than himself. The officer's warning about things being hidden echoed in his mind, adding to the growing unease he felt deep in his stomach. As he walked past the quiet houses and empty storefronts, he noticed a black car parked at the edge of the road. It was a car he didn't recognize, but what caught his attention wasn't the car itself, it was the figure standing beside it. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, was leaning against the vehicle, watching him. Theo felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He couldn't explain why, but the man's gaze made him feel as though he were being hunted. He quickened his pace, turning a corner to avoid the stranger's eyes. But as he did, he heard footsteps behind him, fast and purposeful. Without looking back, Theo began to run. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from the man following him. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned onto a side street and sprinted down the narrow road. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder, but he refused to stop. If he could just get to his house, he'd be safe. He reached the small park near his home, gasping for breath. But as he slowed down to catch his bearings, he realized that the footsteps had stopped. Theo turned slowly, trying to spot any sign of the man, but there was nothing. Just the fading daylight and the distant hum of traffic. The sense of danger had not gone away, though. If anything, it had only intensified. Theo knew he wasn't imagining things. Someone, maybe more than one person, was watching him. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a police siren sliced through the silence, making him jump. His heart skipped a beat as he saw two patrol cars come into view, pulling up to the edge of the park. The officers from the diner stepped out, their faces serious and unreadable. "What's going on, Theo?" the first officer asked, his voice low but stern. Theo hesitated. "I don't know, I didn't want any trouble. I just returned Mr. Miller's wallet. That's all." The officers exchanged a look. The second officer took a step toward Theo, his gaze hard. "We need you to come with us, son." "Why? What's happening?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Theo protested, his voice trembling. The first officer, who had been quieter than the second, stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not about what you've done, Theo. It's about what you're caught up in. We need to take you in for your own safety. You don't understand what's going on, but we do. It's better this way." Theo's mind was reeling. His hands shook, and his chest felt tight with anxiety. He didn't want to go with them. He didn't want any part of whatever mess this was becoming. But at the same time, something inside of him, something instinctual, told him that if he didn't go, things would only get worse. The officers weren't asking, they were telling him. The second officer placed a firm hand on Theo's arm, guiding him toward one of the patrol cars. "Get in," the officer ordered. As Theo sat in the back of the patrol car, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The streets of his town, once familiar and safe, now felt foreign and threatening. His thoughts spiraled, and his heart raced with the fear of the unknown. What had Franklin Miller been involved in? What did the police know that he didn't? And why did it feel like he was being swept up into something that he couldn't control? Minutes later, the patrol car turned onto the road leading out of town, and Theo couldn't help but notice the black car again. This time, the figure in the dark coat wasn't standing by the vehicle. Instead, the man was walking slowly toward the edge of the town. Theo couldn't shake the feeling that this man had been watching him for a reason. The officers exchanged a glance, but neither said anything. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of streetlights. As they left Brookhaven behind, Theo's mind was consumed with questions. What had he gotten himself into? Where was Franklin Miller, and why had the man acted so strange when Theo returned the wallet? And most importantly, why did it feel like the answers were slipping away faster than he could catch them? The ride was long and silent. Theo sat in the back of the patrol car, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the seat as he stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of Brookhaven disappear into the distance. The officers didn't speak to him, and the quiet only made him feel more isolated. It was as though he were being dragged into a world he didn't belong to, one filled with shadows and unanswered questions. The car eventually pulled up to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. It was a place Theo had never noticed before, tucked away behind tall, rusty gates and overgrown bushes. The officers didn't say a word as they led him inside, their steps deliberate and heavy. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as the officers directed Theo down a narrow hallway. At the end of the hall, a door creaked open, and they shoved him into a small interrogation room. It was sparse, just a metal table, 2 chairs, and a single window that didn't let in much light. Theo sat in one of the chairs, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was a storm of confusion and fear. He had no idea what was happening, but the longer he sat there, the more he realized that something much bigger than a lost wallet was at play. The officers hadn't told him anything, just that they were protecting him. But from what? And why had Franklin Miller seemed so nervous when Theo returned the wallet? After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and a new figure walked in. This time, it wasn't one of the officers, but a man in a suit, dark, pressed, and sharp. His face was stern, his eyes calculating. He was older than the officers, but there was something about him that made Theo feel like he was looking at someone who knew far more than he should. The man took a seat across from Theo, folding his hands on the table. "I'm Agent Harris," he said, his voice low and measured. "I know this must be confusing for you, Theo. But you're in a very dangerous situation right now." Theo's heart skipped a beat. Dangerous? What did that mean? Was he in trouble? I don't understand. I just found Mr. Miller's wallet and tried to return it," Theo stammered. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why are the police involved? Why is Mr. Miller being treated like this?" Agent Harris leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "It's not what you think, son. Mr. Miller isn't just a sweet old man who lost his wallet. He's connected to something much larger, something that could endanger you and everyone in this town." Theo felt a chill run down his spine. What was this man talking about? He had known Franklin Miller his whole life. He was just an old man who sat quietly in the diner, sipping his coffee and reading the newspaper. There was no way he could be involved in anything dangerous. But Agent Harris continued, his voice firm and unyielding. "Franklin Miller has connections to a criminal syndicate, a network of individuals involved in human trafficking, money laundering, and worse. He's been under surveillance for months. What you don't know is that he's been grooming people, getting them involved in his operations without them even realizing it." Theo's mind reeled. Human trafficking? Money laundering? It was like something out of a movie, not the quiet town he had known his whole life. "So why am I involved?" Theo's voice cracked as he spoke. "I just found a wallet. How could I be connected to this?" Agent Harris's expression softened, but only slightly. "You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That wallet wasn't just any wallet. It was a signal, a way for Franklin to get someone else involved in his dealings. He knew you'd take it to him. And once you did, it was game over." Theo sat back, stunned. The idea that a simple act of returning a lost item could drag him into something so dangerous was almost too much to process. "But I didn't do anything," Theo whispered, his hands trembling. "I know you didn't, son," Harris said. "But the people we're dealing with don't care about right or wrong. They care about control. And you've unwittingly become part of their plan." Theo was silent, the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy fog. He had always thought of his town as a safe place, a place where nothing bad could happen. But now, he was seeing it all in a new light. The small town he'd grown up in was hiding a dangerous secret, one that he had stumbled into without even knowing it. "I'll help you," Harris continued, his tone serious. "But you need to trust me. If we're going to take down this network, we need to figure out who is really behind it. And we need to do it without drawing attention to you." Theo's thoughts were swirling. He wanted to say yes, to trust Agent Harris, but fear gripped his chest. He didn't want to be involved in this dangerous world. But at the same time, what choice did he have? The web had already been spun around him. And trying to pull away now might cost him more than he could afford. "I'll do whatever it takes," Theo said, his voice barely above a whisper. Agent Harris gave a small nod. Good. We'll keep you safe. But you need to understand one thing, there's no turning back now. Theo didn't know what to expect next, but he knew one thing for sure, his life had just changed forever. The following days blurred together, each one passing in a haze of confusion and fear. Theo had been moved to a safe house, a small, hidden cabin on the outskirts of town, far away from the familiar streets and faces he'd grown up with. The cabin, surrounded by thick woods, felt like a prison, though Agent Harris assured him it was for his own protection. Theo didn't feel protected, though. He felt more isolated than ever. The weight of the truth that had been revealed to him was heavy in his chest. Franklin Miller, the old man he had trusted, the one who had always seemed harmless, was at the center of a criminal empire. And somehow, that empire had its sights on him. Theo spent most of his days pacing the small cabin, wondering how he had gotten himself into this mess. He was just a teenager, trying to do the right thing by returning a wallet. Yet, somehow, he was caught up in a dangerous game he didn't understand. Every time he thought about Franklin, he felt a mix of anger and betrayal. How could the man who had seemed so kind be involved in something so monstrous? Had Theo been duped all along? Was he just another pawn in a much larger scheme? But even more than that, Theo was terrified. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, made his heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He didn't trust the police anymore, especially after hearing what Harris had said. The officers who had arrested him, who had acted like they were protecting him, were now part of the same system that had pulled him into this mess. It was all connected, and Theo had no idea who he could trust. One afternoon, as he sat by the small kitchen table, staring at his hands, his mind raced with questions. What was it that Agent Harris wasn't telling him? Why had he been so insistent that Franklin Miller wasn't the only one involved in the syndicate? Who else in Brookhaven was connected to this dark web? And most importantly, how could Theo get out of this without losing everything? It was then that the door creaked open. Theo looked up, his heart leaping in his chest. "Are you alone?" the voice asked, its tone low and cautious. Theo stood up quickly, his pulse racing. The voice belonged to a woman, young, but with a maturity in her voice that made Theo pause. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman stepped into the cabin, her dark eyes scanning the room quickly before resting on Theo. She was tall, with short hair and a calm, measured demeanor that immediately put him on edge. "Calm down," she said, holding her hands out in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just here to help." Theo didn't trust her. He couldn't. After everything that had happened, he wasn't sure who was on his side anymore. But there was something about her that felt different, something in her voice, in the way she carried herself, that made him pause. "Help me with what?" he asked, his voice cautious. The woman glanced toward the window, her gaze sweeping the room as if making sure no one was watching. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "You've been pulled into something much bigger than you realize," she said. "And I think you need to know the full truth. I'm one of the people working to take down the syndicate you're caught in. I can help you, Theo. But you have to trust me." Theo felt his heart skip a beat. Another person who claimed to be trying to help him. But how could he trust anyone now? "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his voice sharp. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer to him, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, Theo felt as though she could see right through him, like she knew all his fears, all his doubts. "Because I know what Franklin Miller is really doing," she said, her voice steady. "And I know that if we don't stop him, things are going to get worse. Much worse." Theo's mind whirled. What could she possibly know about Franklin that he didn't already? And why was she here now? "How do you know all this?" he asked, still skeptical. The woman gave a small smile, though there was no warmth in it. I've been following the trail for years. Franklin Miller isn't just some old man running a diner. He's been using people like you, people who trust him, to do his dirty work. And now that you're involved, you're in danger. You have two choices, Theo: help us take him down, or let him keep using you. Theo's head was spinning. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he felt the pressure mounting. The stakes had never been higher. I don't know what to do, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The woman stepped forward, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. You don't have to decide right now. But know this: whatever you choose, you won't be alone. We'll be watching your back. Theo felt a small flicker of hope rise inside him. But it was fleeting. No matter what choice he made, he knew the consequences would be far-reaching. He was in deeper than he had ever imagined, and there was no turning back. The following week was a blur for Theo. The woman, who had introduced herself as Clara, had kept her word. She worked with a small group of agents dedicated to taking down the syndicate, and every conversation with her was a step further into the web of secrets and dangers that had surrounded him since the moment he found Franklin's wallet. But it wasn't just Franklin's past that was haunting Theo. It was his own. Clara had warned him, quietly and with urgency, that the people they were up against were not just criminals, they were master manipulators, always thinking 10 steps ahead. Theo had to be careful, she said. They knew how to find anyone who had even the slightest connection to their network. What Clara didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that Theo's own past was the one thing that might be more dangerous than any criminal syndicate. One afternoon, after Theo had spent hours flipping through stacks of old files in the cabin, trying to understand the full scope of the syndicate's reach, a knock on the door broke the stillness. Clara wasn't there. She had stepped out for a moment, leaving Theo alone. His heart raced as he moved toward the door. Who could it be? He cautiously opened the door, and his blood ran cold when he saw who was standing there. It was his uncle, Richard Green. Theo hadn't seen his uncle in years. Richard was the black sheep of the family, a man who had spent time in prison for various offenses, a man whose name Theo's parents rarely mentioned. As a child, Theo had been told that Richard was trouble, that he was someone to be avoided at all costs. But there he stood, in the doorway, a grim expression on his face. Uncle Richard? Theo stammered, his voice shaky with a mixture of shock and confusion. What are you doing here? Richard looked down at him, his eyes cold, but there was a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, beneath the surface. I came to talk, Theo. Can I come in? He asked, his voice gruff. Theo hesitated, but the knot in his stomach told him that he had no choice. He stepped aside, allowing his uncle to enter. Once inside, Richard glanced around the room before turning his attention back to Theo. He was thinner than the last time Theo saw him, his clothes ragged and worn. His face had aged prematurely, like time had taken its toll on him in ways that no one could see on the surface. Sit down, Richard said, motioning to the chair across from Theo. Theo did, his mind racing. What did Richard want? Why now, after all these years? Richard sighed, rubbing his hands together nervously. I know you don't want to hear this, Theo. But there are things about your family you don't know. Things that I never wanted to tell you. Theo's heart skipped a beat. He had always known that Richard had a past, but hearing it spoken aloud was something else entirely. He braced himself for the worst. What are you talking about? Theo asked quietly. Richard's eyes flickered with a kind of fear that Theo had never seen before. It was a vulnerability, raw and unguarded. Your father. Theo, your father wasn't who you think he was. Theo's stomach dropped. His father, a man who had been absent for most of his life, had always been a mystery to him. His mother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was always with a hint of sadness. But never had Theo imagined that his father's secrets could be this dark. Richard continued, his voice low and tense. I tried to keep you away from all this, but I see now that it's too late. Your dad was involved with people, dangerous people, people like Franklin Miller. He was deep into the syndicate long before you were born, and when you found that wallet, you unknowingly walked right into their world. You're a part of it now, Theo. Your blood ties you to them. Theo felt his world tilt on its axis. His father? A part of this criminal network? But, no, that can't be right, Theo whispered, shaking his head. My dad wasn't. I mean, he was never around, but he wasn't like them. He couldn't be. Richard's expression was pained. I wish I could say you're wrong. But you're not. The syndicate, they get to everyone, Theo. You're already marked because of your family. And now, they know you're involved. Theo felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath him. He wanted to scream, to run away, but there was nowhere to go. His past, the family he had never fully understood, was the very thing tying him to the syndicate. The people he had thought he could trust, the people who had raised him, who had told him to do the right thing, had kept him in the dark. Richard's face softened for a moment, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. You have to be careful. The longer you stay in the dark, the more danger you're in. The only way out is to confront it. You have to make a choice now, Theo. You can't run from this anymore. Theo's head spun with the revelation. His father, Franklin, the syndicate, it was all connected, a chain of events he had never even seen coming. Uncle Richard, what do I do? Theo's voice trembled, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and sorrow. You need to trust Clara. She's the only one who's been trying to protect you. If you want to survive this, you need to face it head-on. Theo nodded slowly, the weight of his family's legacy pressing down on him. The boy who had once simply wanted to do the right thing was now staring down a future he never could have imagined. Theo's mind was reeling from everything Richard had just revealed. His family, the past, the connection to the syndicate, it was all too much to process. He had been trying so hard to do the right thing, to simply return a wallet and help an old man, but now he understood that his good deed had only made him a target. His life, which had once seemed simple and straightforward, was now anything but. That night, Theo didn't sleep. He spent hours pacing the cabin, going over everything in his mind. Clara had said that there was no turning back now, but what did that mean? Could he really fight against the criminal empire that had been manipulating his family for years? And why did it feel like the more he tried to get out, the deeper he was pulled into the mess? The next morning, Clara arrived, her expression serious but not without a trace of concern. She had been helping Theo navigate the complex world of the syndicate, but even she was starting to show signs of exhaustion. This wasn't a battle that could be fought without sacrifices. Theo, Clara began, her voice steady, but with an underlying tension, we need to move fast. The people we're dealing with, they've found out about you. They're closing in. We have to act now before they make a move. Theo looked at her, his throat tight. What do you mean, they found out about me? How? Clara's jaw tightened. I'm not sure. But I suspect it's because of your uncle. He may have gotten careless, or maybe someone's been tracking him. The bottom line is, they know we're onto them, and they won't stop until they silence anyone who knows too much. Theo's heart pounded in his chest. His uncle's betrayal had just made everything more complicated. Richard, who had warned him about the syndicate, had now unknowingly put him in even greater danger. We need to leave, then, Theo said, his voice low but firm. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us. Clara hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face as if weighing his resolve. It's not that simple, she said finally. They're not just going to let us walk away. They'll be watching every move we make. If we don't do this carefully, we'll be playing right into their hands. Theo clenched his fists. The fear that had been building inside him now twisted into something else, something much stronger. He was done being the pawn. He wasn't going to wait any longer. He had already lost too much. His family's past, his life, had already been turned upside down. There was nothing left for him to lose. Then we fight, Theo said, his voice full of determination. Clara regarded him silently for a moment before nodding. All right. We do it your way. But you need to understand, this isn't going to be easy. And once we start, there's no going back. Theo didn't flinch. He had already made his decision. If the syndicate wanted a fight, then he would give them one. They spent the next few hours preparing. Clara shared everything she knew about the syndicate's operations, the people behind it, and how they were connected to Franklin Miller. They were ruthless, organized, and incredibly dangerous. But Theo was done being afraid. He had already come this far. Now, it was time to take the fight to them. As night fell, they gathered their things. The plan was simple: they would confront the syndicate head-on. Clara had connections to some key players who had been trying to bring down the organization, and with their help, they would expose Franklin Miller and the syndicate's criminal empire for good. But as they were about to leave, the sound of a car pulling up outside made Theo freeze. Clara's face went pale. She moved quickly to the window and peered outside, her eyes scanning the darkness. "They're here," she muttered, her voice tense. "It's happening now." Theo's pulse quickened as he moved toward the door. He wasn't going to let fear stop him anymore. He had made his choice. If he was going to survive this, he would have to fight for his life, and the lives of everyone he cared about. Without thinking, Theo opened the door. The cold night air hit him like a wall, and the shadows of the trees stretched out in the distance. He could hear voices, low and murmuring, but they were too far for him to make out clearly. Clara's eyes flicked toward the door, her hand reaching for the small gun tucked in her waistband. "Stay back," she whispered urgently, but Theo didn't listen. This was his fight now. He wasn't going to stand by and let Clara do everything herself. Just as he stepped outside, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man, his face obscured by a dark mask. His eyes gleamed with cold indifference as he approached Theo. Behind him, a group of men stepped into view, all wearing dark clothing, their faces hidden. Theo's heart hammered in his chest as the man in the mask spoke. "You shouldn't have come here, kid. You're in way over your head." Theo swallowed hard, but his voice was steady. "I'm not backing down. You've hurt too many people, and it's time for you to pay for what you've done." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can stop us? You think you've got any power in this world? You're just a boy, Theo. A boy who's already lost." Before Theo could respond, Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the man. "If you want to keep breathing, you'll walk away now," she said, her voice full of warning. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. For a moment, the tension was palpable, as if both sides were waiting for the other to make the first move. Then, without warning, the man lunged. The moment the man lunged, time seemed to slow for Theo. Clara reacted first, her body shifting into a defensive stance, but the force of the attack caught both of them off guard. The man's speed was unnerving, and for a split second, Theo thought they might be too late. Theo's instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he grabbed a nearby rock and threw it at the man. It struck the attacker's shoulder, distracting him long enough for Clara to land a solid blow to his ribs. The man grunted, stumbling back, but quickly regained his balance. The group of men behind him began to close in, their cold eyes fixed on Theo and Clara. "Stay close," Clara shouted to Theo as she reached for her gun, taking aim at the approaching figures. But there were too many of them, and they were already too close. Theo could feel the weight of his decision press on him. This was the point of no return, the moment when he had to stand and fight or risk losing everything. Clara fired a shot, but it missed. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the night, sending the men into a frenzy. The attacker in the mask rushed forward, this time faster, and Clara barely dodged his grasp. The others advanced, closing in on Theo and Clara from every direction. Theo's heart raced as he realized the odds were against them. His thoughts flashed back to his uncle's warning. His family had been part of this world, and now, so was he. But he wasn't going to go down quietly. He wasn't going to let these people, these monsters, dictate his fate any longer. "Clara, we need to get out of here," Theo shouted, but he knew there was no easy way out. They were surrounded. The masked man lunged again, but this time, Theo was ready. He grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a broken piece of wood lying on the ground, and swung it at the attacker's head. The man recoiled, but Theo didn't stop. He kept swinging, the adrenaline flooding his veins, the fear turning into raw determination. Clara continued to fight back, her quick movements countering the attackers, but she was starting to show signs of fatigue. Her focus was divided between the men advancing and keeping Theo safe. "You need to move, Theo," Clara shouted, her voice hoarse. "Get to the car. Now." Theo hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the edge of the clearing, but the men closed in faster. One of them reached out, grabbing Theo by the collar and yanking him back. The force of it sent him crashing to the ground. Clara whipped around, her gun in hand, but she was too late. The man who had grabbed Theo was already raising his fist, ready to strike. "Let him go," Clara yelled, but the man ignored her, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Theo's chest tightened with fear as he struggled to free himself. This was it. If he couldn't get free, everything would be over. He thought about his family, about his uncle's warnings, and the life he had always taken for granted. In this moment, he realized just how much he had to lose. And then, just as the man's fist came down, something snapped inside Theo. With everything he had left, he kicked out, sending his foot squarely into the man's knee. The attacker staggered back with a yell of pain, loosening his grip on Theo. Clara didn't waste a second. She moved quickly, her gun firing once more, this time striking the man in the leg. He dropped to the ground, groaning in pain, but his comrades didn't retreat. Instead, they circled, and the battle grew fiercer. "Go, go, go!" Clara shouted again, grabbing Theo's arm and pulling him toward the car. Theo's legs felt like lead as he stumbled, but he pushed himself to run, knowing they had no other choice. The sound of footsteps behind him, the harsh breaths of their attackers, urged him forward. They reached the car, and Clara quickly shoved Theo into the passenger seat before jumping into the driver's side. The engine roared to life, and she slammed the car into gear, speeding away from the clearing. Theo's heart was still pounding in his chest, the fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. But even as they sped down the dark road, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The lights of the clearing grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight of their fight, of everything they had just lost, settled in. "Clara, we can't outrun them forever," Theo said quietly, his voice shaky. Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the road ahead, her grip tight on the wheel. "I know," she said. "But we don't have time to worry about that now. We need to regroup, figure out our next move." Theo leaned back in his seat, the rush of everything that had just happened still overwhelming him. He had fought, he had survived, but at what cost? He had chosen to take a stand, to face the people who had taken so much from him. But the price of that choice had already been made. He had lost his innocence, his safety, and now he had to pay the price of doing what was right. The darkness of the night outside seemed endless, but within it, there was a glimmer of hope. They had escaped. For now. But Theo knew that the battle was far from over. The road stretched out before them, long and empty, as Clara drove through the night. The headlights barely illuminated the winding path ahead, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. Theo stared out the window, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of fear, guilt, and confusion. He had never imagined that doing the right thing, returning a lost wallet, could lead to this. Yet here he was, caught in the middle of a dangerous game, surrounded by enemies he couldn't even see. Clara's eyes were fixed on the road, but she could feel the weight of Theo's silence beside her. She understood what he was going through. She had seen it all before, the disorientation, the fear, the overwhelming realization that you were a pawn in a much bigger game. But there was no turning back for either of them. The battle they had fought was only the beginning. Now, it was time for them to face what came next. "You did good back there," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "You're stronger than you think." Theo didn't respond right away. His mind kept replaying the events of the past few days, the wallet, the police, the confrontation with the men in the woods. Everything had happened so quickly, so violently, that he hadn't had time to process it all. And now, as they sped away from the danger, he realized just how much had changed in such a short time. "I don't feel strong," Theo admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel lost. Like I'm drowning in everything that's happened." Clara's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but she didn't look at him. She understood. She had been where he was. The weight of responsibility, the fear of losing everything, it was something she had lived with for years. But there was one thing she had learned over the years of fighting this war: it was all part of the price of doing the right thing. The moment you chose to stand up and fight, you became part of the battle. And there was no turning back. "Feeling lost is normal," Clara said, her voice steady. "But you need to understand something, Theo. The moment you chose to stand up to them, you made a choice. You chose to fight for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. And that's more than most people ever do." Theo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and uncertainty. "But what about everything I've lost? My family, my home, everything feels like it's slipping away." Clara glanced at him briefly before turning her eyes back to the road. "Sometimes, Theo, you lose things. Sometimes, you lose people. But that doesn't mean you've failed. It means you found something more important. You've found your courage. Your strength. And that's something no one can take from you." Theo's chest tightened, and for the first time in days, he felt something resembling clarity. He had been so consumed by the fear of losing everything that he hadn't realized what he was gaining. His actions, returning the wallet, standing up to the men in the woods, had changed him. They had made him a part of something bigger than himself. And no matter how dark the path ahead seemed, he knew he wasn't alone anymore. They drove in silence for a few miles before Clara spoke again, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "Everyone has a choice, Theo. A moment when they decide what kind of person they're going to be. Some people run, some people hide. But the ones who stand and fight, the ones who face the darkness head-on, those are the ones who change the world. Even if it's just one small part of it." Theo felt a flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have to be afraid anymore. Maybe this was his chance to change not just his own life, but the world around him. He had been handed an impossible choice, and he had made it. He had chosen to fight, even when it seemed like the whole world was against him. "What happens now?" Theo asked, his voice quiet but determined. Clara's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no joy in it, only a quiet strength. "Now, we keep moving. We keep fighting. And we don't stop until it's over. Until Franklin Miller and everyone like him are brought down. You've got a part to play in this, Theo. And I'm not going to let you back out now." Theo nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility settle on his shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel as heavy. He had made his choice. He had taken the first step, and no matter what came next, he knew that he wasn't walking this path alone. As they drove deeper into the night, Theo glanced out the window at the dark landscape stretching out before them. It was a long road ahead, filled with obstacles, dangers, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, Theo felt something different, a sense of purpose. He had chosen to fight for what was right. And that, no matter what the cost, was a choice he would never regret. The road was long, but it was his road to walk now. And as he looked ahead, Theo knew that the fight wasn't over, it had only just begun.